Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Scorn running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U with 8 GB of RAM. We're taking a look at the game right now running at the lowest in-game graphics settings with FSR set to performance mode, and this is FSR 2.0, and we're running this at the 15-watt stock TDP. Now the game is a very slow-paced game with not a lot of action and a lot of very enclosed spaces. There are certain areas that are a little bit more open, but not anything too dramatic. It's not an open world game. It's pretty linear with a little bit of exploration that you have to do. And I was hoping that this would actually let us get some pretty decent levels of performance in here, but unfortunately it's the 1% lows that really suffer here. And you can see by the frame times that there are certainly some major issues going on here. And we're very much capped out when it comes to the RAM. So it might be that the 8 GB of RAM might just be the limiting factor here, because we do get some pretty solid averages considering that we are at 1080p, of course using FSR, but we are also at the lower 15-watt TDP that the chip is set to for stock. You will really feel the performance issues here though. This is not something you can just ignore. Everything just feels so heavy to do, even though it's a slow-paced game with not a lot of action going on and mostly just puzzle solving. It just is so inconsistent to try to play that I don't think that most people would find this to be very enjoyable at all. So at least the 15-watt TDP really just seems to be absolutely brutal to try to do. Of course, I tried raising the TDP all the way up to 25 watts to see if that could actually net us a nice little uplift in terms of performance, and while it did boost the 1% lows a little bit, it didn't really do too much. Depending on the area that you're in, it'll be in the double-digit range in terms of just being slightly above 10 to sometimes dropping down to the single digits. And if you just pay attention to the frame times, you'll see that they still suffer greatly throughout all of this, and it's not something that ever really gets resolved. So it really seems that with the 8 GB of RAM, 1080p with FSR set to performance mode is just completely out of the question. It's not going to be something that's going to be doable. It's really unfortunate. I was hoping that a single player game like this with a lot of enclosed spaces would end up netting us at least somewhat of a playable experience. We're going to have to test it out with 16 GB of RAM at some point to see if that can actually fix those 1% low issues that we're having here, because the frame times are just really brutal, and that's what's really dragging down the whole experience here. Even lowering the base resolution down to 720p and using FSR on top of that wasn't enough to uplift those 1% lows to get them into playable ranges. The averages certainly look really nice, but it's the 1% lows that really suffer, and at this setting, FSR started to exhibit some weird graphical issues. In certain areas where I would walk past, the screen would get very glitchy and the frame times would just completely fall apart. And this was only at 720p with FSR. If I went back to 1080p with FSR, everything was perfectly fine. So it really seems that 720p with FSR is just not going to be doable here, and it doesn't really net you an increase in any meaningful capacity. And of course, the averages are still pretty good, but the 1% lows are what just drag down the whole experience. It borders on the edge of playability. You'll look at the frame times, and they look significantly better than if we were just at the full 1080p resolution. But as you roam around and look and load into different areas, the frame times will start to suffer. It's certainly far more doable, but it's the fact that it now introduces these graphical glitches that happen in certain areas that kind of just drag down the whole experience. So hopefully switching over to 16 GB at some point will actually let this be far more playable, but as it stands right now, with the 8 GB of RAM, it just does not seem to really be there. And it really just comes down to those 1% lows. Again, if you look at the frame times right now, they look perfectly fine, but you load into different areas and you'll see spikes that end up happening, and there will just be a lot of inconsistencies that end up happening. And of course, those graphical glitches do end up happening in specific areas. It wasn't just a one-time isolated incident. They do happen in other areas, and it happened frequently enough that I thought that there was something wrong with the system. I thought that I was getting artifacting that was just showing that the system itself was just dying. But again, switching over back to 1080p fixed those issues. So it just seems to be an issue with 720p and FSR. Definitely something to keep in mind. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.